I was just checking if it was okay to start. Anyway, welcome everybody to our symposium this evening. My name is David Trent. I'm the chair of the art department. I was going to say MC, but that's going to be Professor Carson. But my job is to welcome you and orient you to what's going to happen here. First, I should acknowledge that this evening's presentation is brought to you by the generosity of the Claire Trevor School of the Arts and, importantly, Illuminations, the Chancellor's Art and Culture Initiative. And I mention Illuminations because its purpose is to provide arts experiences to undergraduates from across the campus, regardless of their majors and regardless of their disciplines. And the idea, as you might guess, is to build bridges between the arts and the sciences and other areas. And the reason I mention this is that it complements perfectly the orientation of Claire Trevor School of the Arts, but very much the Department of Art, which is bringing you this event tonight, inasmuch as contemporary art has, for much of the last century, been as much about what goes on in the museum and the studio as it's been about the world outside of those areas. And this involves reaching other disciplines, talking about the things that affect our lives, and including the way we form impressions, mental processes, and consciousness about our world, which brings us to tonight's gathering. As most of you, I think, know, the topic for tonight's symposium, H.M. and the Aesthetics of Memory, is the story of a gentleman named Henry Mollison, who came to be known as Patient H.M. Mollison was born in 1926, a Connecticut resident, suffered persistent and increasing epileptic seizures to the extent that in the 1950s a surgery was performed to try and abate his symptoms. And the unusual and extraordinary results of that surgery became what I was informed by Professor McCaw earlier was even a more important and vital moment in the history of neuroscience after that. So the story of H.M. and the peculiar amnesia that resulted after his surgery became the subject of the film installation that you see depicted on the screen, and which will be discussed later tonight. What shall I say more? Well, that it is here for our discussion, and we have a panel that I will now introduce. So, fortunately, with us is first and foremost in the center, the artist behind the exhibition and installation at the Contemporary Arts Center entitled H.M. by Carrie Tribe. Carrie Tribe, in the middle. Tribe received her MFA from UCLA after attending the very well-known Whitney Independent Studies program in New York. She's known primarily for her film and video works and installation works, as you see on the screen, which largely address the mechanics of temporal media, specifically, in some instances, filmic media, as in this case, but the way temporal media reflect and help us understand issues of perception, narrative, memory, and so on. Tribe's works have been shown at the Hammer Museum, the Hirshhorn Museum, the Whitney Museum. She's received the Creative Capital Award, the USA Artists Award, and needless to say, she's an international figure, and I'm very pleased to be bringing you this work and have her present with us tonight. To your left is Professor James McGaw. Who will be bringing a scientist's perspective to the discussion? Professor McGaw, you may or may not know, is one of UCI's founding faculty members. He came to us in 1964, and I was just speaking to someone in the audience and saying, what was it about UCI's selection process back then that they made so many good bets that would end up paying off? McGaw's early work was on the relationship of stress hormones and certain kinds of medications and drugs to memory formation. He would later extend that and focus on both memory and learning, and later still, help us understand the way various regions of the brain play a role in the constitution and processing of memory. He was at UCI Dean of Biological Sciences, the founder of the Department of Neurobiology, and more recently, the first Center for the Neurobiology of Learning and Memory. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Arts and Sciences. Finally, our moderator tonight is Professor Julie Carson of the Department of Art. Carson is also the artistic director of the UCI University Art Galleries, a position she has held for over a decade. She curates and organizes many of the shows that we've been so proud of over the years. Carson is also the founding director of UCI's Critical and Curatorial Studies MFA program. She's known for her scholarship in many areas, as well as the seminars that she presents internationally on the work of Jacques Lacan and other psychoanalysts and philosophers. Her most recent books include The Limits of Representation, Psychoanalysis, and Critical Aesthetics, as well as the forthcoming work, The Conceptual Unconscious. And with that, I'll get out of the way.
Thank you, David, and thank you everybody for coming, and thank you for Jim and Carrie for partaking in this dialogue. I was saying to everybody who's I've been talking to preparing this event is that I've been actually waiting 10 years or more to do both Carrie's show and to actually, with the mind of having Carrie and Jim talk to each other. I have research background, not just in art and aesthetics, with conceptual art and experimental film that Carrie specializes in. I've done research in neuroscience, and of course know Jim's work very well also as a colleague on campus. And so if we're thinking about the aesthetics of memory, of course science has its own aesthetic, and each of these very important and transgressive intellectuals we have on stage, what we're going to find out tonight is that on the subject of aesthetics, scientific aesthetics and art aesthetics, is that, as I said, they're very transgressive in what they find. Jim's research, is particularly important in making us understand that memory that's associated with emotion can be scientifically qualified and understood, meaning through experimentation, and so that there is an objectivity to emotion that lands up in memory. And Carrie, on the other hand, is transgressive in art and understanding that aesthetics is not just about the color blue that maybe Matisse would use, or the motion that Calder in his sculptures would employ, or the sound that Chopin, his nocturnes, etudes, or preludes would take up. As wonderful as all that is, that there's an analytic side to that sensorial experience. So, and I would just say that Lacan, Bruce Fink, who is one of the scholars on Lacan, who David was saying I study, Lacan interests me, as does several other intellectuals that I teach on, and those of you who have taken my classes know that generally these scholars that I'm interested in are not only transgressive and important in what they do, oftentimes they're exiled. We don't have that tonight, but they're exiled, and Bruce,
Not yet.
not yet. and Bruce said one of the best ways to get rid of somebody in academia is to, you don't like them, is to evoke science with a capital S. And that means, that, you're not doing your quantifiable, qualifiable data. And so to actually make a science out of emotion as it connects to memory is not just important in its own right, in its discovery, but in a Foucauldian sense, very important in changing how we think about science. And I would say, following that in turn, in art, one of the ways to get rid of people in academia is to evoke art with a capital A. That it's not aesthetic, it doesn't look like art, it doesn't make me feel a certain way. Well, when you say that, you are feeling a certain way, aren't you? Anyway, but Carrie actually shows that in a Brechtian way, that you can feel your heart race and think your thoughts quite analytically at the same time, following in the history of conceptualism and structuralist film, not to mention other movements that did not make a distinction between what we associate as the heart over determining art and the brain over determining science, the brain being analytic. So the last thing I'll say, and then we're going to start, is that as several of you in the audience know how much I love mobilizing the metaphor of the Venn diagram. If we're talking about the aesthetics of memory, is at that center place where art and science are going to intersect. So we're going to talk about some pretty transgressive attitudes in art and science as they take up memory, and be mindful of the aesthetics of both of them. So we're going to start by watching Carrie Tribe's film that is in the gallery, and we had an installation shot up there that I want you to keep in mind, that we're looking at documentation, because the piece is meant to be experienced with the double projection, spooling from one projector to another, right? An analog film spooling at a 20-second time frame, such that when what you're seeing projected here is a demo, but in the gallery in real time, you're seeing something on the left screen, and then 20 seconds later you're seeing it on the right screen, and 20 seconds is the span approximately of procedural memory. And so we want to show you it as a digital document, but after we're done here, there's a reception immediately following with alcohol, where you can actually see the operation as it was meant to.
So as I had warned our technicians, I have a really excellent knack for bringing technical disaster everywhere I go. So what was working beautifully up until I left to get my coffee is now not working. We have to do a little forced quit of the application. We're going to restart it, and we should be good. It'll take 1 second, and if it doesn't start up, we'll just screen the film. That part's working.
Oh, okay.
In fact, let's just go right to this. Just the PowerPoint quit for a moment, so we will.
And then if we, whoever's handling the lights, once it starts, we can kill these lights so that they're not focusing.
Are you all set?
Yes.
Are you recording now?
Just getting level.
But it's going on the tape?
Yeah.
Because I'm going to try not to use any names. How are you feeling today?
I feel okay.
That's good. You look great.
Oh, well, thank you.
H.M. was born in 1926 in Manchester, Connecticut. He came from a working-class family. His father was an electrician, and his mother was a homemaker. When he was 9 years old, he was knocked down by a bicycle, and he was unconscious for 5 minutes. The next year, when he was 10, he had his first minor seizure, what we call an absence, where he would just drop out for a second or two and then pick up where he left off.
Henry. Henry,
Huh?
were you dreaming?
I think so. Yes.
What were you dreaming about?
I dreamed I was a doctor, a brain surgeon, and just thinking about the successes and the non-successes and the things you could have done. But you'd see the good of the operation.
Can you tell me what you look like?
Well, I say that I'm tall and thin, but heavy. And I say I have brown hair. I have dark brown hair.
On his 16th birthday, he had his first major seizure, his first generalized
I
convulsion.
have dark brown hair.
He was in high school at that time, and the other boys teased him about his epilepsy, so he actually dropped out of high school for a couple of years and then went back to a different high school. He graduated from high school when he was 21 years old, and after that went to work as a motor winder. He had to give up that job because his seizures increased in frequency to the point where he just couldn't work anymore.
H.M.'s family relationships were strained, the seizures were increasing in frequency, and the anticonvulsants he took carried significant side effects. H.M.'s family doctor referred him to the head neurosurgeon at Hartford Hospital, William Beecher Scoville. Dr. Scoville believed that he could cure H.M.'s epilepsy by removing a portion of the temporal lobe, including the hippocampus, the region where he thought H.M.'s seizures were originating.
In 1953, when H.M. was 27 years old, Dr. Scoville performed what he called a frankly experimental operation, in which they removed tissue in an area toward the middle of the brain, right above the ears. This was called a bilateral medial temporal lobe resection. This operation was really a last resort because H.M.'s life prospects were rather dismal.
You said something about an operation.
Yeah, I said no to myself. I better not be a surgeon. You could make the wrong movement and the person could be dead or paralyzed.
Okay, Henry.
I was thinking about the question and the answer, doubly in a way.
What was the question?
Well, a question of just how things would be or could be, and for an understanding, you have to have everything all at once.
During the operation, Dr. Scoville made 2 small holes in H.M.'s skull. Through these holes, he inserted retractors, which he used to lift up the front part of the brain, the frontal lobes. Aspiration requires inserting a small instrument into the intended target and sucking out brain tissue. So Scoville proceeded to remove the hippocampus on both sides, along with cortex surrounding it, areas that we know today are critical for the establishment of long-term memory.
Henry, what are you describing?
A dream you might have.
So you weren't remembering anything just now?
No, it was like a dream.
Like a dream, or was it a dream?
Well, it was like reality, but still a dream.
H.M. made a good recovery from the operation, but it was immediately apparent that he could not lay down new long-term declarative memories. His immediate memory was fine, but the instant something distracted him, he lost all sense of what had happened just moments before.
We now know that immediate memory lasts about 20 seconds. H.M. could therefore remember information for about 20 seconds before it was gone forever.
H.M. remembers all that happened to him up to the time of his operation, but can recall next to nothing that has happened since. Between 1953 and 20 seconds ago, his episodic memory is blank, and that blank space grows longer at the same pace that his life moves forward.
I grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut. One of my best friends lived across the street from me. Our houses had matching floor plans. We used to walk to school together, play hopscotch together. We even made a walkie-talkie with 2 tin cans connected by a string that spanned the street. My friend told me that her father was a neurosurgeon, but I had no idea what that meant. Do you know how old you are?
I know I was born in 26.
Are you in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s?
I think 40s or 50s, right there on the borderline of that,
Where are your parents?
in East Hartford. I know I was
Are they there
born in
now?
26. I think they are.
Years later, I found myself reading about a brain operation my friend's father performed on a young man trying to cure his epilepsy. The operation resulted in the patient losing his capacity to make new memories. My friend's father was William Beecher Scoville, and the patient was H.M. I met H.M. in 1962 when I was a graduate student. Beginning in 1966, H.M. used to travel to MIT to the Clinical Research Center, where my colleagues and I would test him. So I've known him since 1962, and he still doesn't remember who I am. Have we ever met before, you and I?
Yes, I think we have.
Where?
Well, in high school,
In high school.
yes.
Have we ever met any place besides high school?
Now that I don't, no, I don't think so. Yes, I think we have.
On a physical level, consciousness manifests in the neural networks of the brain. Neurons communicate through tides of electrochemical activity with charged salt ions pulling and pushing inside and around the cells. This creates the chain reactions that ultimately constitute memory.
Just a different coastline, a lake, and a boat, and fishing, and not fishing, but swimming in it too.
Can you tell me about the water?
It was clear water, and if you dive deep enough in the area, a certain area, you can go through a tunnel like and come up inside a cave. And then, because no one's been there, or, well, yes, someone has found out about it, and they told others not to go there because possibly they couldn't hold their breath long enough. And I'm always wondering how the air inside the cave part is freshened. And you're sort of having an argument with yourself and why you wouldn't try it, because if you did, how would you get back?
One of the clues that we had from other instances of brain insult was that after the onset of the memory impairment, people sometimes had impaired memory for the years before the insult to their brain. That's called a retrograde amnesia. We wanted to examine H.M.'s remote memory to see whether he had a retrograde amnesia.
Professor Suzanne Corkin and her colleagues at MIT designed a test called Famous Faces to assess the cutoff point for H.M.'s memory. H.M. did a superb job recognizing people from the years preceding his operation. In contrast, his knowledge for famous faces after 1953 was, for all intents and purposes, nil.
When was World War II?
Well, it was in, it began in 1939, and we got into it on December 7th.
Who did we fight in the Gulf War?
Well, it was mostly Mexico and Cuba in the Gulf. 1939.
While H.M.'s memory from the years prior to his surgery in 1953 appears to be largely intact, scientists were surprised to discover that, in recalling his own past, H.M. appears to be reporting the gist of things that he knew to have happened, rather than re-experiencing or reliving his life.
And what is your favorite memory that you have of your mother?
Well, that she's just my mother.
But can you remember any particular event with her that was special?
Well, of course, she's my mother.
One of the most significant contributions H.M. has made to our understanding of human memory was the discovery that, despite his profound amnesia, H.M.'s non-conscious procedural memory still worked, and thus he could learn new motor skills. With repetition, his errors during mirror tracing, bimanual tracking, and rotary pursuit consistently decreased, even though he never remembered having taken the test before.
What's the matter?
Were you dreaming?
No. Where is this?
You're at MIT.
Huh?
Okay. You didn't dream.
No. Thinking.
What were you thinking then?
The thought I had, well, was I causing interference?
Where?
Well, in the machine. It would be a combination of one thought being twice. Of course, it was the same thought right next to itself, you might say.
What is it you're talking about now? Are you talking about the electrodes?
Just putting it on and a double put on one time. One side was put on, but the other side wasn't. That's what I mean by the double.
Okay. But you weren't dreaming.
No.
Okay. Well, what's the last thing you remember seeing?
I don't know.
Nothing.
I don't know at all.
One of H.M.'s favorite activities was doing crossword puzzles. He believed that they improved his memory. He could see that at a previous time he had succeeded, and perhaps that motivated him to keep going. You like to do crossword puzzles, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Why is that?
Because sometimes I remember words, and sometimes I don't have to look them up. I remember them.
You are terrific at remembering words.
Well, I used to do them too before I was sick and everything.
And what kind of sickness was it?
They called it epilepsy at the time.
And how did that affect you?
Well, I knew that if I had it, it would be cured sooner or later, and that's just what I had to look forward to in a way. I knew they would do something to me and I would be cured and get my, parts of my memory back.
It would be cured sooner or later, and that's just what I had to.
Those who know H.M. report that he's always observing them, trying to gauge what is expected of him, what's appropriate. What would it be like to live without recourse to the past, to lose the fourth dimension of time and live in the three dimensions of space alone? Perspectives would flatten, and one could only guess at what these signals from the other dimension might mean. In this way, time would not be linear and fixed, but liquid, malleable.
Everyone that H.M. was close to before 1953 is either dead or gone from his life. For all practical purposes, he recognizes no one. In 1980, H.M. was admitted to a nursing home. At the time of this recording, he is on the decline, physically and mentally. H.M. is no longer well enough to travel to MIT. He has never been filmed, photographed, or videotaped.
Yeah, so I thought I would just say a little bit about some of the different things that you saw in the film and maybe answer in advance a few of the questions that typically come up. So one question about the film is, there's this strong kind of sculptural and structural element where you're basically looking at a strange apparatus that was custom built to allow one film to be played in two parts. Why is that important? And so from the very beginning, I kind of knew before I even heard of Patient H.M. that I was interested in trying to create an experience for the viewer that would produce some kind of cognitive dissonance that in which the sort of experience of the viewer phenomenologically and through their sort of self-conscious awareness of what they were watching would reflect the content of the story that they were hearing. And so I always knew I was interested, I wanted to try making this film that could somehow be experienced twice, but beyond that I wasn't really sure what was going to happen. And when I heard the story of Patient H.M., and learned that when he was left with essentially just kind of working memory, the short-term recall that for all of us lasts around 20 seconds or until one is distracted, it dawned on me that in film, unlike in digital media, time and space are really directly related. A certain length of film will produce a 20-second experience. And when I thought about what had actually happened to Patient H.M., a kind of excision of a part of his brain that we weren't aware at the time was responsible for the consolidation of experience into long-term memory, I realized that that too had a very kind of fundamental, material basis. So from the beginning, the project was driven by an interest in the kind of, for me, it's really very hard to get my head around how physically embedded consciousness is. And I sometimes regret not ever studying psychology or neuroscience in school. I went to a university that had no distributional requirements. I never took science classes after high school, and I'm playing catch up. But on the other hand, I think if at an earlier age somebody had explained to me that yes, consciousness is all found up here somewhere between the ears, I might have gotten used to that idea, and I still can't get used to that idea. I mean, it still completely blows my mind that while I'm up here talking, having my experience, everybody else in the room is having their own experience, and you'll walk away remembering different things. To me, that's just phenomenal. And yet we're here having the same experience too. So maybe it's good that I didn't really know what I was doing, but when I heard the case of Patient H.M., I thought, how can we figure out how to do this? If you could go to the next slide. So you first approach the film, you see the apparatus first, as I say, and then you walk around and you find yourself in a room where a lot of people don't really notice the film apparatus, or they think maybe they've seen two films. And a lot of people come out of having watched the film and don't realize they've in fact seen two parts of the same film. So on the left, we have an experience in the film that happens exactly 20 seconds earlier than the image on the right. And as you can imagine, editing such a project would be a real bear. You have to always be thinking in two places at once. Wherever you are, you have to know what happened 20 seconds earlier and 20 seconds later. And 20 seconds, being the rough approximate duration of all of our working memory, is kind of hard to get your head around. I had such a struggle to figure out at any point where I was in this film, and I started to realize this was actually the kind of key to the project, that my viewers too might forget things 20 seconds after they've happened if there wasn't a strong emotional connection with the material in the first place. You know, if you don't recognize, raise your hand if you recognize Ollie North. Okay, there's a very clear, I mean, it's basically, you know, but there's an age difference. Let's just say, there's a very clear age difference. So you remember seeing Ollie North, and the rest of you were like, what, you know, there was a picture of some guy, it doesn't mean anything to you.
Yeah, so for me, that was Kent Stage, and I say that in the essay. It's like, when I saw this first, you get it, you're watching it, and you're like, yeah, I can't believe that was shown before, because I think I'm seeing it for the first time on the right-hand side, and so I'm paying attention that my working memory is failing me, except for when Kent State comes, and boy, I'm like, there it is, and there it is, and I'm looking around at people at that time who were a certain age, and I'm like, wow, they saw that iconic image for the very first time on the right side of the screen.
Yeah, so that happens. I mean, in their faces, I don't recognize either, that H.M. would have recognized and I don't.
Right.
So that in a way points us to this kind of subjective and emotional relationship we have to memory and history. But also just to speak a little bit about how the film was made. These are, you know, there's a lot of different material in there. We've got stills and animation, material that was shot on film, material that was shot on video, reenactments and historic stuff. So if you could go to the next slide. This is an example of a scene you may remember from the film in which footage of the lake, you're hearing about H.M.'s dreams, or what he thinks may have been his dreams. In the 1970s, he participated in a sleep study at MIT where he was woken up every so often during REM sleep and non-REM sleep and asked what he remembers having thought. And the results of the study were found inconclusive. Suzanne Corkin, the voice you heard, who did most of this research with MIT, said, you know, there's no way to really know if he was dreaming or what he was reporting. But interestingly to me, most of the reports came back that he was dreaming things like, you know, swimming underwater, from a memory from his childhood, coming up in a cave, and worrying, will he ever get back to where he came from, which sounds a lot to me like a metaphor for, you know, consciousness. You know, you go under for this procedure in which they're going to take out a part of your brain that's never been done before. Will you ever be able to get back? His other dreams often reflected, or what he says were dreams, reflect concern about becoming a doctor, having some problem, causing some irreparable harm to a patient. So while Suzanne Corkin, as a good neuroscientist, had to kind of throw that out, as someone interested in psychoanalysis, I wanted to eat that shit up. I was like, well, this is really the interesting moment when we can start to see the sort of slippery space in between, and how much we really can't know about what we think we know and what we think we remember. This footage was shot in some lakes, around some lakes in Maine. I did a lot of research with the help of Suzanne Corkin at MIT into H.M.'s background, and to the best that I could, I went back to places that were significant to him, and I opted to shoot that material on film with a Bolex camera. If you could go to the next image. Interestingly, the Bolex camera, it's this great little, very versatile film camera, has a crank on it, and you run the crank, you know, wind it all the way up, and then if you pull the trigger, you could shoot for about 20 seconds before the camera will stop, before the motor runs out. And I thought that was sort of too perfect a relationship to what I was doing not to use it. So I shot all of the footage that was sort of real or authentic with this little old-fashioned home movie camera that H.M. and his family might have had, you know, something like that in his day.
And real and authentic, you mean in situ, like
Yeah.
going to the real places that the documentary was referring to.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Not reenactment,
Yeah.
not sets, but actually places.
Yeah, to produce what we call in documentary traditions like see-say. Somebody talks about something, you show it. You go there and you show it. And when you watch the news, watch what they show, because often somebody will be talking about the White House You get a picture of the White House, when was that taken? That has nothing to do with what's going on, right? But it solidifies the experience. You can connect the two, the sound and the image line up. So this seemed like the appropriate method of shooting that authentic, real-life stuff in situ. Could you go to the next image, please? And this is what you shouldn't do with a borrowed Rolex camera, but it produces a nice look in the end. A friend had a camera, and we went to Maine, and it was the first time I had ever shot film. Can you go to the next image, please? And then the resulting image. So just to be clear, in post-production, we were able at times to produce these kind of seamless tracking shots, times when everything would produce a kind of plentiful, beautiful panorama, in part to create more tension around those moments when things aren't working. When you see, if you could go to the next image, please. You know, 1991 is not the year of that civil rights event. 1991 was the year in which I first encountered the kind of social unrest around systemic racism. It was the year of the Rodney King meeting. And so for me, that 1991, when it came up the first time, I don't remember now what's in the film when it comes up the first time, but it made perfect sense to me, subjectively, that it should be up when we get this fire hose on a civil rights march on the left. If you could go back one image, please. And then there was this interesting moment. I mean, one reason why Julie's been a very important intellectual figure for me is there's no refusal on Julie's part to say, here we have psychoanalysis, here we have neuroscience, and the two shall never meet. That happens a lot. I mean, you have neuroscientists laughing at the psychoanalysts, and you have psychoanalysts poo-pooing neuroscience. In this day and age, it makes no sense, I think, to do that. So when Suzanne Corkin, after recording most of our voiceover, after lending me all of these cool apparatuses that H.M. had actually worked on to test his memory, confessed to me that she actually grew up across the street from the family whose father performed the surgery on H.M., it kind of blew my mind. And she, I think it ends up being in the introduction to her book, but she saw this as a grand coincidence, which, I don't know, take it as you will. So I went back with my Rolex and found her house and found the house next door, and we filmed that. Picture. There's the Kent State, yeah, so one educational experience and another. This is the high school that H.M. actually went to on the left. Next image, please. And then there's a lot of animation in the film. And there came a point early on when I realized that while it was important to me to kind of do my best to get the science right, as it were, in the film, there were certain things I didn't want to show and that I wanted to be able to operate sort of more evocatively with. So when the voiceover describes the procedure that was done to H.M. with his front, with these sort of holes drilled in his head and the frontal lobes lifted and parts of the midbrain suctioned out. At that point, the image that came to me that seemed to make the most sense, and I'm an avid gardener, was the way milkweed, when it opens, sends these little seeds flying all over the place, just kind of floating off. So that was the animation accompanying that. And for some reason or other, this recurring motif of oceans and salt water and swimming and kept coming up in the content of the work, and so it seemed that this moment in the film would provide an opportunity to talk about, just to kind of tease out some of that. Like the voiceover's talking about charged ions pulling and pushing in the brain, but this is an image of a jellyfish. I think that's it.
Yeah, and then just to segue, because we want to look at some of Jim's work, his work and his appearance on 60 Minutes. One of the interesting things I'm looking forward when you're having this dialogue is that, Carrie, your work is, as you've said before in interviews, is less about remembering. If you think about memory as remembering, right? But in your hand, you're pointing out how memory is about forgetting. And of course, the recent research that we're going to see in 60 Minutes that Jim is conducting is his discovery of so-called memory wizards. That's the colloquial term. It's actually has a scientific term for it that I know but forget. That's about remembering, I guess, too much in some ways. But as we'll see, and as science knows through things like reconsolidation theory, that memory is not so binaristic between remembering and forgetting, and that's what more Venn diagram, right? It's that right consciousness is right in the middle of remembering is simultaneously forgetting. So if we can cut now to a clip of Jim on one of his, it's not the most recent, 60 Minutes, he's a regular on 60 Minutes.
That's from 2006.
Irregular.
I'm a regular.
It turns out our memories are sort of like jello. They take time to solidify in our brains. And while they're setting, it's possible to make them stronger or weaker. It all depends on the stress hormone, adrenaline. The man who discovered this is James McGaugh, a professor of neurobiology at the University of California, Irvine. McGaugh studies memory in rats, and he invited us to watch the making of a rat memory. In this case, how a rat who's never been in this tank of water before learns how to find a clear plastic platform just below the surface.
Well, he'll swim around randomly.
Oh, can he not see the platform?
No, he can't see the platform. His eyes are on the top of his head.
The rat will swim around the edge for a long time until eventually he ventures out and by chance bumps into the platform. The next day, he'll find the platform a little bit faster. But watch this rat, who learned where the platform was yesterday, then received a shot of adrenaline immediately afterward.
Notice that it starts out not on the edge.
Oh,
There you go.
oh, that's impressive. Adrenaline actually made this rat's brain remember better, and McGaugh believes the same thing happens in people.
Suppose I said to you, you know, I've watched your programs a lot over the years, and although it pains me to have to tell you this, I think you're one of the worst people I've ever seen on now don't take it personally.
So my stress system would go into overdrive, no question.
Even with my telling you that it's not true, there's nothing to keep you from blushing, from feeling warm all over.
I am warm all over.
Yeah.
I am, no joke.
That's the adrenaline. And I dare say that you're going to remember my having said that long after you've forgotten the other details of our discussion here. I guarantee it.
McGaugh says that's why we remember important and emotional events in our lives more than regular day-to-day experiences. The next step in his research was to see what would happen when adrenaline was blocked. He started experimenting with propranolol.
Propranolol sits on that nerve cell and blocks it so that, think of this as being a key and this is a lock. The hole in the lock is blocked because of propranolol sitting there. So adrenaline can be present, but it can't do its job.
Watch this rat, which just yesterday learned where the platform was, then received an injection of propranolol. Today, he just swims around the edge as if he's forgotten there ever was a platform out there. Across the country at Harvard, Roger Pittman read McGaugh's studies, and a light bulb went on.
When I read about this, I said, this has got to be how post-traumatic stress is.
Wait, this got to the interesting part.
Now it's your turn to share it.
Well, you see, memory is not memory. It's not that we have memory. We have all kinds of memories that are created under different conditions and last under different conditions. And what you just saw is the kind of memory which is lasting. So that if you are mildly aroused, you're going to remember whatever happened just before that for a longer period of time. And the reason for that is that the development of the lasting memory, the long-term memory, is in progress. And if you do something to influence that memory that is in progress, you can make it stronger with actions of stress hormones, or you can make it weaker by blocking it with drugs that block the actions of stress hormones. That's been sort of the basis of my work. But that's just one form of memory. The thing about this work that was first discovered, H.M. was first discovered by Brenda Milner at McGill University, and then later Suzanne Corkin was the one who spent many years working with him. The brilliant discovery of Brenda Milner, a psychologist in Canada, McGill University, was that she was asked to go down to Connecticut to take a look at some people who had had surgery on this region of the brain. And she took along a lot of stuff that psychologists at that time had. She put them in a suitcase and went down there. And she was the one who discovered that H.M. could not make any new lasting memories. So the development of long-term memory that I was able to produce in the rats up there can't be done. That H.M. nonetheless could carry on a conversation and remember things for a short period of time. Right there, you've got two kinds of memory. Right there, in one subject, in one patient, was the discovery that there are mechanisms that allow for two different kinds of memory. There must be something in there that allows the person to carry on a conversation and yet never remember that at a later time, because that's based on a different kind of memory. And then on another occasion, just by chance, Brenda Milner threw into her suitcase a little motor task, learning how to draw a star, but while looking at a mirror, and you saw that in the film up there. And lo and behold, she found that H.M. could do that. And so this is another form of memory, procedural memory. And so it says, first of all, that here's a region of the brain which is not a locus of memory, but it's a region of the brain that allows memories to become permanent. It facilitates the making of permanent memories, and that's this medial temporal lobe region. And that this region of the brain is definitely not the basis of our remembering what I have just said. What I've just said is not the property of this medial temporal region. It's a property of something else. And if you were taking notes on any of this, your ability to take notes has nothing to do with this region of the brain. This was a cornucopia. It was the most important discovery in the history of brain research and memory. There's nothing that comes close to it, because it opened up the whole thing to say, look, there's a panoply of memory processes, and we need to understand the machinery of each one of these. And that's why it was so terribly important. It also speaks to the issue of consciousness, because you have to ask, what is the nature of consciousness such that you hear me now, but your memory of it subsequently has very little to do with what you were remembering at the present time? What sense does it make that you listen to me now and you can write what I have said using a motor skill? So there cannot be a unified concept of consciousness and memory. The brain, it turns out, doesn't work that way, and it was Brenda Milner and Suzanne Corkin who told us that.
I have a question. Based on this, and I understand that the amygdala was also partially or fully removed in the case of H.M. And one of the questions I get a lot from viewers of the film is, was he devastated by his condition? Did he get very upset? Was he sick of being tested? And I would often turn to what little I know about the amygdala and say, well, if this is the region of the brain that is responsible for producing strong emotional fight or flight tendencies, you're not, and it was damaged or removed, you're not going to see that. But it's sounding to me now like the removal of the amygdala, if it's related to the production of these stress hormones, it may in fact be the absence of the stress hormones that is causing problems, or in part responsible for causing problems in his ability to make lasting episodic memory, not just the hippocampus, which is, until I met you, what I thought.
Well,
maybe I'm wrong.
No, that certainly is going to contribute to it, and most of science has not taken that into consideration, but that's my domain. That's what I've worked on. The amygdala, which is right in front of the hippocampus in the medial temporal lobe, was also removed bilaterally on both sides. And most people who looked at this at the time, and a lot of people now say, well, it's just thrown away, it's because it's not important anyway, you see. But it could play a role in the absence of his ability to make new memories of very important things, because in my laboratory and many laboratories throughout the world, we've learned that the amygdala is a key structure that, when activated, plays a role in creating the strong memories. So poor H.M. got a double whammy. He got removed a region of the brain which is instructive and making a record of what happened in the long term, but also it removed a region of the structure which is important in ensuring that important events in particular need to be remembered. So he got a double whammy in that regard, but you don't usually see that because very little research was done on H.M. to see if memories could be made stronger by emotional arousal. On the other hand, I have to flip it over and say it is reported that when he was told that a relative had died, that he'd get upset about it. And then when he's told the next day that the relative has died, he'd get upset about it all over again because he couldn't remember that he was told the day before.
The emotion's not gone, it's
so the whole story is not going to be written by H.M. because there are many, many, many studies afterwards that have filled in a lot of gaps and taken it in different directions. So on, for example, different parts of the medial temporal lobe play different roles for different kinds of information. That's all been learned since then. But that would never have been asked had it not been for H.M. I was a professor in 1957 when this surgery was done, and I knew nothing about it at the time, and it was about 10 years before it became obvious what it was all about. To the extent that people were looking at the brain for memory, they were looking for the locus of a memory. And what H.M. provided is not the locus of a memory, but the locus of a process which is critical for the forming of memory, and that's something that's very different. So this was a huge impact on science, just absolutely huge.
What's interesting to me about the moment in 57 in which this is a case in which the symptom is also the cure to actually produce new research, because, certainly if they're trying to make this individual not have epileptic seizures to a debilitating level, it's all about maintaining cognition, and maintaining cognition certainly is having memory and awareness. And of course, science at that time, it's not just that the connection wasn't made between emotion and memory. Of course, H.M.'s the one who does that, but he does that because they just throw out, if they know that that part's emotional, that's just what you're going to throw out, because nobody ever thinks, like, that's the thing, that's the one thing we can get rid of.
No, we learn by heart.
Yeah.
Remember, that's the expression we use, we learn by heart,
Right.
and somehow that's different,
Right.
as though the heart is containing
Aristotelian
information,
philosophy.
No, that's you have a very different take on that. It was interesting to see that there was the Pike-Hour Center for Learning and Memory, shown in the film right there. If it hadn't been for H.M., there would be no Pike-Hour Center for Learning and Memory because the field was not all that developed. I was in the field at that time, and honestly, I don't think there were more than 24 people in the world who were doing research on brain learning and memory at that time. 20 years after 1957, it probably would be difficult to get a tally of how many people in the world were working on the neurobiology of learning and memory. Not that everyone works on the hippocampus and adjacent structures, but it opened the field to say, yes, we can make discovery about the neurobiological basis of memory. Because of this accidental discovery, it tells us what kind of experiments we can now do. And that information simply was not known before.
And so let me ask one, just to follow up on my observation, or interest, not observation. How long did it take, and this was before your research, which is actually stems from 57 forward, but can you speak about how long it took for science to catch up that, here it is, let's just take the emotional part out, because certainly that has nothing to do with cognition. Oops, it has everything to do with it. It's a process, not a location. And then how long does it take? You're a pioneer in it for people to realize the sort of eureka of their blind spot is what actually makes us understand that analytics and and emotion, or in psychoanalytic terms, the id and ego are not separated.
About 30 years.
30 years.
About 30 years.
Okay.
But it was driven by, it was not driven by just sitting at the desk and having an insight. It was driven by experiments. Let me just tell you, for example. In my laboratory, Paul Gold, he's a professor at Syracuse University now, but he was a postdoctoral researcher with me, did the first, in my laboratory, the first critical experiment in which he injected the hormone adrenaline into laboratory rats immediately after they were trained, or 10 minutes later, half an hour later, or 2 hours later, tested them the next day, and found that the animals remembered significantly better than animals that got a saline injection, a control injection, if they received the hormone immediately afterwards or within 10 minutes. So that was a very important experiment.
And what year was that?
That was 1975. Right? So we then began to look for the place in the brain where the adrenaline might be active, because we didn't think that we'd learn by heart. We thought we'd learn by brain, so we had to get in the brain and do that. We were doing other experiments in which we were stimulating various regions of the brain electrically to see if we could find regions that would be influenced, regions in which memory would be influenced. And we found that the amygdala was a place where we could actually improve memory or impair memory by stimulating electrically. So we got the idea that maybe the adrenaline acts by turning on this region of the brain. And it took, another 10 years to find that for sure.
And that's true?
Of course it's true.
I didn't know that. I never studied this stuff. No, it's not true. So the adrenaline's swimming around in our blood, but it's really the amygdala that's being acted upon to produce those.
And because we then did experiments in which we injected the first cousin of adrenaline, which is norepinephrine, minute quantities directly into a subregion even of the amygdala, called the basolateral nucleus of the amygdala, and we can get everything that we got with adrenaline put into the periphery. So this is the control region, and it makes memory stronger by communicating to all of the regions of the brain where memory is being processed. So it's not a locus, it is a modulating structure. So the hippocampus gets information, and the hippocampus then is going to send this up to the cortex, because remember, the hippocampus is not the storage of memory, because you took it out of H.M. and he still remembered things, right? All of his old memories were still there. So the hippocampus takes it.
The gist of them were still there.
Yeah, the gist of it, right. And not really episodic, not the details. So anyway, it goes up in there, and what happens is you get excited, adrenaline pulse, it goes up there, affects this basolateral amygdala, which is a key structure. It sends out modulating influences, and it says, in effect, something very important happened, make a strong memory. That's what happens. So you can remove the amygdala, and humans and animals can still learn quite well. They just can't tag it in that way of saying, oops, it's important. We know that because with my former student, now professor here, Larry Cahill, we studied a human who actually has bilateral loss of the amygdala, calcified, and it just occurred naturally in this subject. It happens in quite a few people. We got hold of one subject. So we told this person a very emotionally arousing story, and they said, oh, that's a horrible thing to happen, and commented on that. And then afterwards, he hardly remembered the story at all. So he was unable to make a strong memory of an event because he lacked the structure which modulates in order to make a stronger memory of significant events. Now, but there's a point here. We never would have been encouraged to do these kinds of experiments if there hadn't been the H.M. finding in the first place, because what it says is that there are different regions of the brain that are organized in such a way to play different kinds of roles in the formation and the maintenance of memory. That was one of the major contributions of H.M., as we have seen here.
One of the things that I want to direct this, to continue this conversation, to the artwork that you're attempting to performatively demonstrate this. Can we go back to the two water scenes and then, yeah. So I was struck with, because there's also this work to show this kind of thing happening in art where you have to swoop, no pun intended, but swim uphill to be performative in this cognitive way that might just look like a science experiment. But it does have an emotive level of when you're put into a position of forgetting or remembering, and particularly with the social issues you bring up. Something's happening to the subject to actually understand in an embodied way everything that Jim is talking about that's counterintuitive to us. If we think of memory across, like not across being too upset or too stimulated to remember something. But then further, there's something, one of the things that's interesting to me about your film is that the comparing sort of the inverse relationship of that, of documentary film. The one that's performative with the hands, crank 20 seconds.
The Bolex.
Bolex, which is in situ, and you've edited it as such to make that kind of confusing. So when we're watching that, and particularly this series, I'm there and I can't, if I watch this 100 times, maybe I have because I've written on it, talked about it, taught it, I cannot ever really get them seeing that part next to this part.
Can't really.
And it is his dreamscape, and I'm like, wow, this is the most abstract part of this film. And it's a seascape. The most corny thing you can do in art. We're not supposed to do that, right? So it's the most saccharine sort of part, and I'm frustrated because I'm actually realizing that in the most realist way in this film, I am actually understanding what Jim is talking about in terms of H.M. Conversely, when we go to, and can we go to the dreams, the MIT, I think
There's a sleep study in these
sleep studies. Maybe.
I don't know if we actually even
have
it.
Well, anyway, when he's actually describing that, the water scene is actually cut in later vis-a-vis, when he's lying there and they're saying, tell me about your dream, right? And you can sort of tell when it's doubling over and coming in and out. And there we have sort of as I like to say, the BBC documentary narrative, like just tell me who he is, tell me the story, like we're telling anecdotes. And you're like, yeah, I get it, but it's all cerebral, not emotive, because you actually break the confusion at that moment. The film, which is to say, when it's doing documentary rehearsal in a traditional narrative way, that performative part, you give us a break from that. And then when it's seemingly the most abstract, to me it's the most realist because I've got the operation and I can't keep up with it. To me and it took me a long time to actually watch the film and understand that. So you're doing work on documentary practice, and here's the Venn diagram between science and art and memory, working on aesthetics in this transgressive way. H.M. is such a perfect subject to interrogate the conventionality. It's totally specious about what history and memory is within art. Artists are the worst offenders about it, as are documentarians, in as much as science was. But that's the moment, I think, where the film is doing something as unique as what Jim was talking about, this eureka moment of like, whoops, we make this accident not seeing a connection. Now all we can do is see a connection.
Let me speak to that. We hinted at this just briefly a moment ago, but there's something else about the long-term memory. We act as though his long-term memory is like our long-term memory. So we do time travel. And you can remember what you did yesterday, and you can remember what you did before, and it has a real character to it. Yes, I did that, I remember doing that, and so on. H.M.'s memory does not have that character. He can't reach back and create it. It's not episodic. It is knowledge that. Oh yes, I lived there. It's not as though he goes back, oh, I remember being there.
It's not re-experiencing.
It's not re-experiencing. It's like looking at a notepad and say, yes, I did record that. And the folks who worked on this, including Suzanne Corkin, looked valiantly to try to find evidence that he really did have what we call episodic memory, really remembering and reliving the episodes. And they found only one case in which they think that might document it. It had to be remembering that he flew in an airplane. And that's the only thing in his entire history that they feel was in which the long-term memory is like our long-term memory, in which we can really do sort of internal time traveling and sort of imagine that, yes, we were like that, it did happen, and so on, and he can't do that. So something else is lost there, and science has not yet grappled with that.
So the explanation for why this one event, which to be sure was likely thrilling for him, in the 1950s, the first and maybe only time he flew on an airplane, but why that instead of falling off the bicycle or the surgery or anything else?
Yes, so he has one event which is like ours, and the rest of it is flat.
Yeah, good. I'm just about to open it up, so good timing.
So, for the kinds of memories that you're talking about with respect to us and with respect to H.M. are very cinematic. They're the kind of conventional sort of memories we talk about when we have memories, which are sort of like documentary films of something that we take with our eyes and have documented in our brains. It seems like that's a very different kind of memory from the memory the rat has of swimming around in the tub and finding or not finding the platform to stand on. So earlier on, Dr. Magor was at pains to say there are lots and lots and lots of different kinds of memory, but what we've been talking about is almost exclusively this quasi-cinematic self-storytelling memory. But what about other kinds of bodily memories, the memories of how to dance tango, of how to avoid an oncoming car when you're on a bicycle?
Well, interestingly, and I was going to ask also about the rat's experience and whether rats have truly episodic memory, but I will point out that one of the fascinating things about H.M. was that you hear this sort of shlunk, shlunk every time a still image comes up. It sounds like a shutter. It's actually a sound of his walker. He learned how to use a walker late in life because he could learn new procedural, memory. But he also was able to diagram the various homes he lived in both before and after the procedure. So you're exactly right. He could navigate, and there was a way that he was able to put that, to recall the bodily experience, the somatic experience of navigating, here I turn left, here's the bathroom, into a drawing that was fairly accurate and could be confirmed many, many, many years later.
Yes, but you can do that. You can do that with language. You say turn right, turn left, and so on. The reason for the water maze, because its use was invented or developed by Richard Morris in Great Britain, and the reason for that was that he showed that if you remove the hippocampus, animals cannot do that. In other words, it was driven by the H.M. study. Why? Because this region of the brain is important for our recognition of space. And a Nobel Prize was just given 2 years ago for the person in Great Britain who discovered that this region of the brain also calculates, close your eyes and you know where you are. The hippocampus is doing that job. So it also does space, and it also does this kind of memory. And that's why we used it as a memory task, because if you remove it, animals can't do it, and we wanted to see if we could make animals do it better if we gave them a stress hormone to make it happen. So that kind of memory is improved. This is not to say that there is any other reason for using that task. It's just useful because the convergence happens to be with respect to the hippocampus. And we didn't discover that. Richard Morris discovered that. In other words, we're trying to look where the light is. We try forever to model the human condition as best we can when we do animal studies. So we try to, if the hippocampus is involved, then we try to use tasks, which for the human we know the hippocampus is important, and have analogous tasks that we use with laboratory animals. It's a reason for that.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I was just curious, how did, I just kept thinking, how did the researchers, not procure his consent, but, if his memory only lasted 20 seconds, did they have to keep re-explaining what they were doing, or?
He was quite cognizant of the fact that he was a research subject, that he in fact, a funny story, one of the only, a really startling experience for Professor Corkin was that someone came to the nursing home. He would go periodically to MIT and be driven up. She'd drive down to Connecticut, pick him up and take him to MIT and drive him back a couple days later. And someone said, "Oh, Suzanne is here to see you." And he said, "Corkin?" And it just blew everybody's mind.
That's procedural.
But I think he had heard Suzanne Corkin, Suzanne Corkin, Suzanne Corkin so many times, or he'd look in the mirror and people would say, "Well, why aren't you startled why wasn't he startled to see an old man?" But he had seen that image so many times. But to speak to the issue of consent, I think he, and this maybe raises a broader question of the relationship between identity and memory. He had no episodic memory to speak of, but by all accounts, he was the same person he'd always been. He was courteous, he was warm, he had a sense of humor, he would make little jokes, and he was generous and wanted to be able to help people. And understood that he was participating in that. And I don't, in terms of consent, I don't actually know, maybe you know this, about how that was worked out.
I was just curious if it was like the movie Memento, you know, where he comes to.
I think in a sense, I mean, Suzanne Corkin is a fan of that film, I can say, and,
It's important to note we're glossing over something here.
Yeah.
This was a surgical mistake,
right.
First of all. And what was taken out was not what the surgeon said was taken out.
Mm-hmm.
And MRI results just a few years ago showed that a lot of the hippocampus and medial temporal region is still there. So if he does show a little tiny bit of memory, like saying Corkin, why should we be surprised?
Right.
Now, in laboratory animals, we do a better job than that. If we want to get rid of the hippocampus, we get rid of the hippocampus because we're allowed to do that, or the amygdala, or whatever. This was a surgical mistake. Now, there's also a context here which I think is important that I bring out, and that is the 1950s was a year of a huge number of brain surgical mistakes. It was a period of time in which brain surgery was used an awful lot because there was an assumption made that we can correct mental disorders with brain surgery. You may know that President Kennedy's sister was a little bit of a troublemaker, and so the dad thought it'd be a good idea if she got a prefrontal lobotomy. And she got it, and she was institutionalized the rest of her life. So he was a perfectly reasonably normal person, and they thought it was a good idea to give her brain surgery. So this brain surgery that was being done here was not an unusual effort. It was the spirit of the time, the 1950s. When I was a college student, I worked at Palo Alto Veterans Hospital as a technician, a psychiatric aide. We had a whole ward full, right there, of about 50 people who had failed prefrontal lobotomies. That is, they could no longer act independently as citizens because they'd had their brain operated on, and everybody thought it was okay. I mean, it was a different time.
And it was, as I understand it, done disproportionately to the poor and to women.
Yes, especially to women. Especially to women. And you also have to look at it this way, that our every state had mental hospitals, and running mental hospitals was very, very expensive. And so the idea of doing surgery meant that you could take care of people who had mental problems, including epilepsy, and give surgery, and then they don't have to be taken care of. So that the period of 1950 to really 1962 or so was a period in which it was thought that it was appropriate to treat these disorders in the same way that we think today it may be appropriate if somebody has psychotic tendency to give them an antipsychotic drug, or if they're depressed, to give them a drug for depression. At that time, it was thought rather widely that if you have a problem, surgery was okay. So when we think back on it, it's not, you should not think, what a heroic, what a horrible thing. I mean, this odd thing that should do surgery to remove this region of the brain. No, it was common. It was extremely common among neurosurgery. And in addition to that, pathetically little was done to see the consequences. As a matter of fact, they were so well liked that Moniz, who was the first person to do prefrontal lobotomies, won the Nobel Prize for it. Won the Nobel Prize. And not because it was an intellectual discovery, really. The real reason was because people thought it was going to save a lot of money. Because you don't have to, they thought with surgery, you don't have to house people. If they got epilepsy, you don't have to treat them forever. You just do the surgery and they're going to be okay. So you have to bear in mind the times in which these things were done in order to see that.
I mean, that's what neuroscience shares with psychoanalysis, is it's the catastrophes that move the discourse forward, right? Like every case study of Freud is an escape, right? And then later. What's interesting is the horror of the lobotomies is less the earnest ones. I'm not even talking about family members, but you know, the scientists that are operating. It's like once you know that this is A, not functional, and B, being utilized emotionally and politically by surrounding relatives, that's actually where the war begins.
These were not scientists.
Yeah. Well, I'm a surgeon, sorry.
These were neurosurgeons.
Even a chance to cut is a chance to cure.
Of course.
Also, I have a question on
Yes.
this. Also, just our notion is more of a comment. Our notions of consent have completely changed. Like there are things that we would no longer think were acceptable. And this is not a statement. I think it was awesome. It's more that we would no longer. Not only would we not give those surgeries, but we also have more protections in some areas for patients to make sure that these kinds of films. I don't mean your kind of film, but you understand what I'm getting at. And I guess I think it's important that those notions are still considered when we consider what advancements are made, because it's it can be very abusive, especially as we get into genetics.
Well, I'm curious, and this is a little, I'm tempted to say we should steer the discussion back to something about the overlapping, aesthetics and science, but I do have this burning question, which is about, in a day and age where lots of psychiatric medication are taken either recreationally or performance enhancing. Of course, there are ethical questions. Well, if the introduction of beta blockers shortly after a traumatic event can reduce that event's long-term salience, is that risky, problematic, and or if somebody really wants to remember something, could somebody potentially, is there, I imagine, adrenaline available on the street? Can one say, I really want to study for this test, so I'm going to stress myself out? I mean, how does this get used? How does this get used?
Okay, two things very quickly, because we want to get back to the
topic, but I am dying to know. So.
Very quickly. I was asked to testify before the President's Commission on Bioethics a few years ago, because they wanted to know what was the progress in developing drugs that will enhance memory. And I think you're thinking of the retarded and so on. And so I told them about the research, my own research and other people's research, and argued that it was not necessary because we have within us the ability to do what the drugs do. That is, the drugs that enhance memory work on brain processes that we have that can be engaged normally. I'll give you an example of that. And this is a paper just published recently. A professor at a university gave a lecture, and after the lecture divided the class in two. Half of the class watched a very exciting, emotionally exciting film, and the other watched a film, I don't know, grass growing or something like that. 2 weeks later, they had a midterm exam. Guess which group did significantly better on the midterm exam? The group that watched an exciting film after the lecture was over, because it isn't the content of that second lecture, it was the fact that they got emotionally excited, which drove increased the memory of what they had learned in the previous lecture. So that's one example of in real life. Another one is much more contentious, and that is what do we do about the epidemic of post-traumatic stress disorder? And the film cut off, right when the film on my work was cut off up here, Roger Pittman, a psychiatrist at Harvard University, saw what I was doing and saw an implication that I had not even thought of, and that is that if you can manipulate memory by manipulating stress hormones, would it be possible to shut off the activation of adrenaline after somebody has an exciting experience and prevent the development of post-traumatic stress disorder? And so he did a study. And he had nurses stationed at all of the hospitals in the Boston area, and they would enroll people in the study. When they came in, they had been raped, they had been mugged, they had been in automobile accidents, whatever, and half of them were put into a control group. They got a placebo, and the other half were given propranolol, a drug that blocks the action of adrenaline. Then he tested them 2 months later and found that the patients that had been given propranolol had significantly fewer signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, the bioethicists went crazy over this because they said, is it right? Is it proper to destroy somebody, to deprive somebody of emotional memories? Because emotional memories make us who we are, and should we tamper with who we are? And they wrote an entire book entitled Beyond Therapy, in which I was a poster child of evil. I didn't do that, Roger Pittman did it. But anyway, and so if you play this out, that says that a young child falls and skins his or her knee, you're not allowed to say, there, it's going to be okay, because you're interfering with their nature. They need to benefit from that.
With their trauma.
You say, so anyway.
Get off my trauma.
You can go in the literature and you'll find that there have been many programs throughout the United States with bioethicists and psychologists and surgeons and all kinds of people arguing the merits of trying to treat people pharmacologically to prevent the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. I know where I stand on that issue, but I think other people may have other views.
Well, there's a more subjective facet to the ethical question that's less black and white than that brings us back to art. And I'm just in passing going to mention it, but I mean, that's the subject of Kaufman's Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, right? And just on the subjective, where trauma is libidinal, emotional, romantic, right? And how much that makes your memory.
Well, the deep issue is should we mess with people's memories because memories are who we are? That's the deep issue.
Well, is memory who we are?
Never mind.
But there are different forms of trauma, right? I mean, there's the trauma of rape, and then there's the trauma of losing your first love. I mean, those are different formative traumatic events, or just the trauma of being alive, right? Entering all of this on whatever nuanced way, right? I slipped into psychoanalysis, sorry.
Yeah, but I was asking it in a more general way. Right. Is it appropriate to manipulate who we are? When you think about it, if you're paid attention to all what we're doing here, that's what we're doing with you.
That's all we're doing.
That's what education is.
Well, that's what science and art is.
That's all about it. You walk into an art studio, you would want somebody to say, no, you can't go in because it's going to change your fundamental nature.
But memory is fundamentally is who you are. Why did H.M. not change? You seem to be the same person, right?
Yeah, that's sort of my question, is that, are people that knew H.M. seem to feel that he was the same person.
Yeah, but when the braid is seen on this, I'm like, who was he, right? I mean, he's a nostalgia of himself, because when he said,
he's fixed in time.
Yeah, because when he said, what do you look like? And he said, I got brown hair, I'm about this tall.
My parents are still living in Hartford, Connecticut.
He's a representation of himself.
You see, H.M. could not develop PTSD.
No.
He just couldn't, because he couldn't remember they'd had the trauma.
But there is one other reason.
But we also revise our life stories. That's how we motivate ourselves. Like the idea that we're always changing who we are. That's why we're here. That's why we're doing things. The question for me is not about whether it's appropriate. It's about who decides. Like which experiences should I cut myself off from, and which ones should I not? It's not that I'm doing that every day. I tell a new version of my life story to motivate me to do something new. But there are certain experiences, like I think that you brought up things like there's a difference between having your heart broken and having someone assault you. And certain things we recognize are valuable experiences that lead us to better, and certain ones destroy our lives. The real question for me is who gets to decide which of those things are worth fixing.
These are different forms of misery, right? The one form of don't let the miserable be wasted on the miserable, right? And versus the truly wretched, which is the assault, right?
Yeah, to follow up on this, I think in regards to your question, should we mess with memory? To me, it makes a huge difference whether we think about repression of memory versus modulation of memory. And the repression would be like cutting off adrenaline, or I know of other experiments with returning soldiers to undermine the PTSD by erasing memories of trauma. That is one thing that to me is very different from attempts to help people to modulate or, as you said, revise memories, and in that sense integrate them into a life narrative, integrate them into rewriting a life narrative. And I wonder if you would see a difference there. And narrative and language are crucial to that.
I didn't get the last part of it.
Narrative and language are crucial to this question too, but whether there's a different, I guess the question has to do with sort of repressing memory as opposed to modulating it, and whether, I mean, as I see it, there was an article just on Sunday in the New York Times in the Sunday Review about arachnophobes. I happen to be married one, and it means I pick up a lot of spiders at home. Apparently arachnophobes who are exposed to spiders with propranolol, am I saying it right? Propranolol, a beta blocker, of course still remember that they were arachnophobic. They can hold the spider, and after time, this traumatic reaction to the presence of the spider is reduced. I don't think it's that the memories are erased. I don't think it's that you don't think you have this experience, but that episodic kind of reliving that goes on that brings with it all of the associated bodily symptoms. Anyone who's had a panic attack knows you may not know the source of the panic, but once your heart starts racing, you know it's coming, and it kind of cycles. So to my mind, and this is just my own subjective answer, and I don't know the question was addressed to me, but there is actually a difference. And I wouldn't say, to my mind, people that have been terribly abused, if there's an opportunity to have them seek treatment that actually, rather than re-exposing them again and again to the memory in a way that seems not to be terribly effective in reducing PTSD, as opposed to re-exposing them to recollections of the event with the assistance of something that allows a kind of unlinking of that deep somatic painful experience with the memory. Those are two different issues. I see it that way.
I have a question that might bring to bear a certain relationship to psychoanalytic theory that also was illustrated in some way in the film. That is the important role of repetition. In even the repetition of trauma, or the memory of trauma, is a way of mastering the stimulus of that trauma, a way of forgetting the effect. It has some relationship to lessening, the repetition lessens the amount of, does that have some, have you studied that in the lab? Is there some way that the repetition of traumatic memories is a way that reducing the adrenaline and mastering the long-term nature of a trauma?
That's usually, the term usually used there is habituation, where you become habituated. In the case of people who have post-traumatic stress PTSD, for example, to date, the most effective treatment for that is not a drug, it's exposure therapy, repeated cognitive therapy, where people have a chance to learn with repetition that what they thought was bad is not bad. And it takes that through repetition. You can't just bring somebody in and say, oh, you're afraid of loud sounds? Get over it. No, they don't do that. They have to teach them slowly that loud sounds are not dangerous. And as cognitive therapy.
But apparently it doesn't work so terribly well, right? Apparently it doesn't work so terribly well.
It is the best thing going. It may not work very well.
What if you add beta blockers to that?
Well, I would, but you're not allowed to according to the bioethicists, you see.
But it is being done. I mean, today I mentioned our talk to a friend who's a social worker, and she said, that's interesting, that might explain why one of the veterans I work with was recently prescribed beta blockers. He has no heart condition, we didn't know why he was prescribed this.
Yeah,
It's being used off-label, I suppose.
the problem is, it's not going to work just to give a beta blocker, because it has to be done in relation to the emotional arousal. In fact, what the beta blocker does, I don't know how many of you are music majors, but an awful lot of music majors take beta blockers. Why? Because it helps with stage fright. And so there are a lot of people walking around there who do not have heart problems who are on beta blockers, and that's a sustained sort of thing. That's
For lots of reasons.
That's a sustained effect. But where the beta blocker or any other treatment is supposed to be effective in dealing with emotional disorder is to have the emotional arousal occur and then show it is unimportant, either by giving a beta blocker or by giving the cognitive therapy under those conditions, because you want to tie the reduction in emotional arousal to the event in some way. And but repetition is very important. Just on that theme, let me just give you a little fast-breaking news of the last several years. Repetition as a way to create memory has been studied since 1890, really. Ebbinghaus was the first one to study it. It is only in recent years that it is the act of retrieving that makes memory strong, not just passive repetition. What they found was, in many experiments, I'll just give you one of them, for college students who are studying, they had them either underline the passages in the book, they had them read the chapter twice, or they had the subject read the chapter once and then try to remember everything that was in the chapter. Guess which subjects got a higher grade on the final exam? The subjects who actually tried to retrieve information that they learned. Rereading was useless, underlining was useless. The only thing that improved the memory was the repetition, but repetition under the condition of trying to draw up the information. Now I think this speaks to, back to H.M. H.M. couldn't benefit from repetition because H.M. can't draw things up to build on. In order to repeat, you have something to build on. So if Corcoran was not there for a long period of time, it would take a long time to get Corcoran up enough where it could be repeated. And finally one day he says, Corcoran, the same thing that a normal person could say after one experience, it probably took him 15 years to do.
But that retrieval process, the effort it takes to try to remember what one's read, has research been done on whether it's the emotional arousal associated with that struggle to remember?
No.
That produces it? You don't know? No. You don't know that, but or studies haven't been done.
Hasn't been done.
Hasn't been done. I want to do that study.
Talking about retrieval leads me to think about the relationship, I'll call retrieval bringing back to consciousness, or bringing to consciousness of something that is not currently conscious. This may be a naive question, but is there a correlation or any relationship between the systematic way, the modes or fields of memory that you've talked about with regard to the non-loci of memory, and the way in which levels or structures or systems of consciousness and subconsciousness work also? Is there a correlation between, let's say, bringing back to consciousness of memory, just in the way in which you've been talking about, and its correlation in what we would call being conscious, even self-conscious? Because that seems to me to be one of the great questions of H.M. is the business of how he is, or was not, conscious or aware of himself. Julie says that he was aware of himself as a representation of himself. But of course, that involves all kinds of self-narratives, it involves all kinds of visualizations, etc. How does that relate to the notion of consciousness?
Yeah, well, do we really know that he's aware of himself? Or does he just have semantic knowledge about that? We don't know if he thinks about, I am H.M. Does he have the same feeling that you have when you say who you are? We don't know that. On that whole business of unconsciousness, we know very little experimental about that at all, with all deference to your friend Freud. But there are observations that we make that we have to bear in mind that are not studied very carefully. We've all had the following experience. All of us have had it. I'm trying to think. Let me see. What was the name of that woman who studied H.M.? It was not Brenda Milner. It was the woman at MIT. Let me see. What I can't think about it. And then 20 minutes later, you're driving along the road and Sue Corkin name pops in your head. What is that all about? Well, the best that we can think it's all about there is that we set in motion unconscious, I mean not available to our thinking about it, retrieval processes. And the retrieval process are going jumpity, 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 researching the brain, trying to find Sue Corkin, and then when you don't need it, it pops into your head and you say, thank you very much, it's too late.
Stop thinking about it.
And I don't know, I'm a professor, and for the professors in the crowd, I'm sure this has happened to you, or you're in the middle of a lecture, and you can't remember the term that you're going to be talking about in just a minute, and you keep talking as though nothing is going on. Right? How many of you have had that experience? I certainly have had that experience. And you make up other words which will do that. The students just think you're mumbling, but you mumble all the time anyway. And then it pops in when it's totally useless. Well, aside from it being troublesome, it's also very interesting because it gives us some clue to the fact that we don't really have control over our retrieval processes. We can claim that we do, but what we do is set in motion a machinery which has its own life, and we know very little about that. We know very little about that.
Getting back to the...
Oh, sorry. Can I ask you a question just directly about that? Because I was wondering in terms of the stress hormones and the relation to retaining, to learning a memory, to the formation of a memory. I was wondering in terms of recalling that memory, it seems like there's an adverse effect with stress hormones, propranolol being prescribed for performance anxiety, that has something to do in my mind with forgetting, with that kind of feeling the loss of a word or something.
Like the more anxious you are that you're about to forget the word, the more likely you are to forget it.
Yeah, and so I was wondering if there's a relation in terms of stress hormones and the inability to recall a memory.
Well, we don't know enough about that. We know something, though, I'll tell you, because we've done the research, the same experiment both with laboratory rats and with college students. For preamble is we found that just as with adrenaline or epinephrine, we can enhance memory when it's given after training. We can do exactly the same thing with cortisol, which is the stress hormone that comes from the adrenal cortex. I didn't stress that because cortisol is not released instantly when you're emotionally aroused. It comes into play about 15 minutes later. It increases. It begins to be synthesized and reaches a peak about 15 to 20 minutes later. But it also promotes the storage of information. So if we injected you with cortisol right now, you would remember better what happened just before they got the injection. We can do that with rats readily. But we also learned that there's a danger in that because if you increase the cortisol before you are retested for something that you already learned, it depresses your memory for about an hour. And we did that with human subjects and did it with rats. So we taught them something on one day, and the next day we administered cortisol to them way before or just before they were tested, and there was about a 1 hour dip in retrieval. And I think most of you have experienced taking a midterm exam or a final exam in which you walked in and you said, I'm going to nail this because I really know it. And you get in there and you forget several things you know pretty well. And 2 hours later you say, I don't know why I couldn't do that on the test because I can remember it perfectly well. That's the cortisol effect. So these hormones are not all good. This argues against, by the way, the notion that you should be taking a memory-enhancing drug because they do all kinds of things. Now, in the laboratory, we arrange it so that we can get memory enhancement so that we can study the brain mechanisms underlying memory. But if I or you take the drug because we think it's memory enhancing, it's going to sometimes interfere with acquisition, sometimes it's going to interfere with retrieval, it may enhance memory, but it's got all kinds of other effects. Pharmaceutical companies have spent countless millions of dollars trying to find a memory enhancer, not only because they want to deal with people who don't remember well, but because they want to make a lot of money for those of us who can really remember well but want to get an edge. They have failed. There's never been a pharmaceutical success story in creating a memory-enhancing drug. Why? Because we have too many kinds of memory, and the same drug that will enhance your formation of memory may impair your retrieval of memory, and so on and so on. Why do we think this way? Because of H.M., who told us a lot about memory and caused us to do experiments which will reveal these difficulties. If it hadn't been for H.M., I would not have been able to draw the conclusion that I just drew in the last little bit.
Interestingly, when I was working on the film, H.M. was still alive, and I couldn't meet anyone outside of people that had studied psychology who'd heard of him. While I was working on the film, H.M. died and had a front page obituary in the New York Times, and suddenly he's part of popular consciousness in a very kind of different way. And I do think, I mean, in a way that always, it's just interesting to sort of at another kind of meta level, the way the project has operated, not so differently from our relationship to some of the subjects that are pictured in it, that we know, we don't know, we think we know, we may think we know, and have a different experience that runs counter to that.
A good example of that, to just draw this out, is that H.M. was discovered to have this memory defect, and a lot of psychology books actually point to the hippocampus as memory. Well, that's one place you don't want to point, because there's no memory there. It's just you need it in order to make memory, and they draw their own conclusion.
It was mentioned in the film. I was really fascinated. There was a moment where you were talking about how, in the absence of the ability to produce new memories, that H.M.'s experience of the world was highly spatial. You also had those images of the moon landing. And I was very curious how, in the absence of new memories, how his experience of the world and our literal location in it was impacted by discussions of that. Was that something?
Right, he was surprised to learn that people had landed on the moon. And he was, nevertheless, could learn the word granola, because the memory, those of us that remember September 11th happening, we remember that, but we may not remember what we had for breakfast that same day, right? So the moon landing should be an emotional, that photograph should be an emotional trigger, should be remembered, but he wasn't able to recall it. But the repeated use of certain vocabulary, he was able to recall. His place in history is, I always had this sort of vision of like H.M. was like this little comet with a 20-second tail behind him, and that's all the space that he ever knew.
Did you ever explore with him just...
The use of the word retrieval, of course, plays upon Proust's novel, À la recherche du temps perdu, because his word recherche points precisely to the issue of retrieval, because it takes them, after all, 2,000 pages or so to discover that the Combray walk, which is introduced very early in the book, is really meets up with the other walk, whose name now I've forgotten, even though I know that novel very well. But what is the other walk?
You'll think of it in an hour.
What?
You'll remember it in about an hour.
But there are two walks which are decisive for the novel. And I think it's only in the end of the novel, about 1,000 or 2,000 pages later, that he realizes that actually they meet up, and you can take one to go to the other. So the recherche, the retrieval, is the retrieval.
Just to get, I'm sorry, but to get back to you had asked, did I ever ask H.M.? Just to be clear, I never met H.M.
Yeah, and also I wanted to say, one of the things that I was telling Carrie not to say in the beginning, and those of you who have seen me show this in a classroom, I don't say until the end that he's never been filmed before, that he's dead, he's never been filmed. And talking about this idea that, he's sort of a representation of himself in some ways, like that, and we don't even know what that means, because I'm sort of using that in the way that, like, is that even consciousness? It's just another, in the end of this film, it's another redoubling. I mean, what I love about this is the constant redoubling through narrative, voiceover, as well as his cognitive, and showing you things that you either are going to recognize or not. One of the other redoubling that is finally in the end is that, and that'll go away, like when this film exists beyond your lifespan, because MoMA owns it, people will watch this, you won't be around. And HM is not going to be, you're no longer going to wonder if that's HM, if he's alive, right? Because if you know when he, or even if you know when he died, right? That, like,
although it's tricky because he died the year the film
that's
was
what
made.
I'm saying.
That's what
I'm saying. So you could have, that could be HM because he looks like that if you were
Well,
alive.
that's actually the actor who plays Buzz Meeks in LA Confidential, and he died of a brain injury right after I made the film too.
Right. But the thing, yes, so it's your fault. So, but when we're like going, the way you tick out the clock to his death, which is the death of the moment of representation, another redoubling, and then this person that you're wondering, is that him or is it not? But it's clearly, if you know film, you know it's a representation because you know how the camera is not. But nonetheless, you're lulled into it, and then at the end you said he's never been filmed before. Mm-hmm. You know, and then you know that, like HM, that you're just merely looking at a representation of something, you know, of a subject that you thought you were experiencing his condition, and you actually think that is.
And this is a question for me that I think comes back in some
breaks
way.
the illusion.
Yeah, I mean, just to tie this back, no, but at all, but with this question of like learning by heart and this sort of insistence that we have about a separation between art and science and the heart of the mind. For me, one of the reasons I'm interested in working with cinematic tropes and working with a moving image is that for me, literature and cinema allow for a kind of identification I've never found anywhere else. I can really suspend my own experience and think that I'm in the place of someone else. And it was important to me to find an actor that could convincingly be, I mean, Suzanne Corkin, when she saw it, she said, because she thought the casting process was ridiculous. Just get some old guy, he's not very interesting, just anybody can do it. And then she realized, when she said, no, that's really feels like him. And I think, you know, there's something about that, losing yourself, particularly if you believe it's a documentary, and then you're faced with a kind of you realize that you've suspended your own disbelief. That despite the fact that we've got tracking shots in a 1970s MIT sleep lab, like how could that be, no, it's not possible. And yet,
at the same time, what's unique, and then we should wrap up because we have to go drink alcohol in the gallery and look at that. The thing that's unique about your use of film, which is ubiquitous to greater or lesser, often lesser effect in the art world, let's just be frank, and is the manner in which, on the one hand, you're very serious about the cinematic, not just tropes that you're mobilizing discursively and intellectually, as sort of Brechtian practice influential to me on one level, but also just what does a dolly shot mean? What does it mean the actor being a certain age? Just the meat and potatoes of filmmaking. However, that film would not be what it is without this physical apparatus. It only can be in a gallery. I mean, you can't do this in a theater. And moreover, inversely, even if you allow me to show it in the classroom, it says demo, it's not in film festivals per se, because it doesn't function outside of a gallery without.
And that's what, I mean, that's just I think, I'm not interrupting everybody now, but that's what I think, I mean, what the gallery allows, what art in the context of an installation allows, is a more critical and self-conscious engagement with the apparatus and with one's experience. You feel yourself go in, you feel yourself not knowing and then knowing. Maybe you see, like if we go over to the gallery, you see these works on the wall. Now that you've all seen the film, you might recognize them as related to these crossword puzzles that HM got great satisfaction out of doing. When this was first shown at the gallery that represents me in LA, it's a two-story gallery, you see all these works, you come in, you don't know who these pictures are of, you don't know what these abstract tile-like prints on the wall are. You see the film, you come back down, you have a second experience, and you know something you didn't know before. So for me, again,
there's a cognitive thing.
Yeah, and there's an opportunity to deal with a human body in space and time that nevertheless has that identification that cinema enables, that produces that desire to know and that desire to be taken somewhere, that for me is like the perfect stage for critical thought. That, that without that love there is no point for criticism.
Yeah, but think of all of the inferences that we have to make throughout that film. It's not just getting the visual input, but everything we look at, every single unit of the film, we're making inferences of what that's all about and trying to piece it together as goes along. And that's just like the scientist looking at H.M. and looking at memory, because what you do, you see some stuff like that and you say, how does it work and how can we find out? So metaphorically, it's very similar.
That's an excellent place to end and get us over to have cocktails and look at that. So thanks for being